name is Sean Quimby. I'm the director of Columbia's Rare Book Manuscript Library. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's lecture by the Dewitt Clinton Professor of History, Eric Foner. This is the first event in our new Live from the Archive series, the purpose of which is to connect Columbia University community, as well as the wider public, with the objects that are held by the Rare Book Manuscript Library. In this case, a remarkable account of fugitive slaves, and with the scholars who studied them. That is, the remarkable objects, not necessarily fugitive slaves. The term archive is problematic. It evokes authenticity, truth, mystery, and mistrust all at the same time. We look to the archive in order to know our past and in order to hold our leaders accountable, even as we raise an eyebrow at the ease with which they can alter it. More recently, the term has taken on utopian connotations. Google promises us that the new digital archive is boundless, that they've transcended the physical limitations imposed by paper, and no longer do we need to rely on human beings to decide what and what not to save. Instead, we can simply trust in the ever-expanding cloud. So each of these events will feature a different object or set of objects and a different scholar, but I hope that the series considers some important questions too. What exactly is the archive? What is included in it? And what has been excluded from it, and why? How can we begin to interrogate it in new and meaningful ways? We're fortunate that Professor Foner is here to help us inaugurate this series, but I'd like to pause and remind you that while the book Gateway to Freedom is a new work of scholarship, the object that helped to inspire it has in fact been a part of the Columbia archive for several decades. My point here is that, contrary to what you might think, the archive is neither fixed nor inert. It's ever-changing and enlivened by those who choose to engage with it. So after the lecture tonight, and we'll have time for some questions, I'd like to invite you all to continue the conversation upstairs in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library on the 6th floor. I hope if you haven't been there, you come soon. We'll have a reception, wine, cheese, other hors d'oeuvres. And so with that invitation, I'll turn things over to Ty Jones, who's our curator, Lehman curator for American history, and he's the coordinator of this series. He's the author of 2 books, More Powerful Than Dynamite and A Radical Line. But I would plug those for you, Ty. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're honored and so pleased to welcome Eric Foner tonight. His book, Gateway to Freedom, The Hidden History of the Underground Railroad, has already received an enormous outpouring of praiseful attention. There are so many ways to introduce Eric Foner, the winner of the Pulitzer and Bancroft Prizes, not to mention the Lincoln and Hartman Prizes for good measure. Author of half a dozen significant historical monographs, as well as numerous edited volumes, essays, and textbooks. A public intellectual, an inspiration to generations of undergraduates, mentor to scores and maybe hundreds of PhD candidates and graduate students. But tonight I will speak a little bit about his life and work as a researcher. At Columbia, in fact, his name is synonymous with research. Even if they haven't read his books, any user of Columbia Library knows his name. And in fact, doing a search on the libraries here, there you go. Foner reconstruction is in fact the example that they say anytime you try to do a search on the library. You don't know who he is or what he's reconstructing. People over Columbia know his name. So reviews of his book, from the very first Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men in 1970 to the fiery trial, Abraham Lincoln and American Slavery of 2010, have always praised his research methods. But by far and away, the most fulsome praise was for his masterpiece, Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution, 1863 to 1877, which was published in 1988. One reviewer called it a feat of research that is not likely to be repeated for a generation. And another wrote, the sheer amount of research done for this work would be enough to exhaust most scholars. The author has examined a wide range of primary sources on a number of subjects. Sometimes his research puts the authors of monographs on these same subjects to shame. But despite all these laurels, Professor Foner can still frequently be found in the reading room upstairs at the Rare Book Manuscript Library, or in the stacks at Butler or in other libraries, pursuing further new and underappreciated sources. And for all of these reasons, he is the ideal candidate, the ideal person to open up this new speaker series that Sean mentioned. And we're very pleased to just reveal tonight the digitization of Sidney Howard Gay's Record of Fugitives. This is available now on our website, which offers transcripts, images of the entire Record of Fugitives, and Professor Foner's scholarly annotations. For those who prefer the hard copy, the original will be on display tonight upstairs in the sixth floor. The Record of Fugitives is the type of document that historians dream of discovering. To be revealed again in this way required the fortunate fact that the books themselves were preserved and saved. It required the passage of time to again assert that African American history demanded attention and research. And most significantly, it awaited the skilled scholar to distill its clues into the larger story of American history. So please join me in welcoming that scholar.
Thank you, Ty. Thank you. Let me get my, thank you very, very much. I have to get my remarks out of here. Thank you, Ty, and thank you all for coming here this evening. I want to talk a little about this book of mine that has just appeared a couple of weeks ago, Gateway to Freedom, but particularly about this document here, since we're talking about the archives, the Record of Fugitives, which can be found upstairs and can be seen upstairs after our discussion here. The book is about many things. It talks about the history of slavery in New York City. It talks about the fugitive slave issue in national politics. It talks about legal cases involving fugitives and other African Americans in New York City. But the core of it, or the inspiration for it, was this document here, the Record of Fugitives. As some of you know, I came upon it completely accidentally. It was an undergraduate history major who was working in the Sidney Howard Gay papers upstairs on, Gay was an abolitionist editor, the editor of the National Anti-Slavery Standard here in New York, who later became the editor of the managing editor of the New York Tribune during the Civil War, a very important post. Especially because the editor of the Tribune, Horace Greeley, was such a nut that he was always flying off with one mercurial idea after another, and Gay's job was to keep the newspaper in a more sane kind of radical Republican path. And many scholars were aware, have used the Gay papers for his journalistic career, and this student of mine, who was also employed as our dog walker, to walk our Cocker Spaniel Sammy during the afternoons. And so I saw her many times. And one day she was writing about Gay's journalistic career. And one day she said, you know, Professor, up in box 72, it's a big collection of the Gay papers, there's this thing called Record of Fugitives. I don't quite know what it is, but you might be interested in it. So I filed that away in the back of my mind. And one day I was up there. I said, yeah, you know, bring me out box 72 here. And sure enough, there was this small notebook, very small, or two notebooks, really. And this is the beginning of it up here. And as I said, it's been digitalized. And also, there's a searchable transcription, which I put together, because the handwriting is actually pretty good, but sometimes a little hard to read. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But so on the one hand, as we heard, the existence of this document shows what you can find in archives. It also shows, I'm sorry to say, how poorly indexed the Columbia archives are, because nobody knew this thing was there for years, for decades. It had been sitting there for decades. One or two historians had used it. It had been, I'd never seen it cited anywhere. So we have to further index all our holdings so people can make better use of them. But anyway, what is this document? Why is it important? What's in it? What can you figure out from this little find in the archives? Well, in 1855 and 1856, Sidney Howard Gay, as I say, the editor of the National Anti-Slavery Standard, abolitionist newspaper here, decided, for reasons that are unknown, to meticulously record the arrival of fugitive slaves in New York City at his office. His office way downtown was one of two centers. I don't even like to use the word stations, as people do, because that suggests a more organized system than really existed. But there were two places where fugitive slaves were assisted and sent on their way to upstate New York or New England or increasingly Canada. Over 200 men, women, and children, their experiences are recorded in this these two notebooks. For 2 years he was a journalist, so he interviewed them. He asked them about their owners, why they escaped, how they escaped, who helped them, and he recorded where he sent them, who he sent them to in other places. So it's a little microcosm of the experience of fugitive slaves and this kind of small-scale network, really, in New York, which is part of what we call the Underground Railroad. Luckily, more than half of these fugitives arrived from Philadelphia by train, basically, having been sent by William Still, who was an African-American abolitionist who was the head of the anti-slavery office in Philadelphia. And Still kept records like this also. Everyone knew about Still's records. They are digitalized by the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. But taking Gay's and Still's, you actually can, first of all, correlate the stories of these fugitive slaves and add information about them from one to the other, and it helps you to expand. Still had more information about where they came from, and Gay had more information where he sent them to. And so putting them together is a way of checking the consistency of their stories, which turn out to be very consistent and quite reliable. And anyway, this document is a treasure trove of information about slavery, about fugitive slaves, and about abolitionism. So I want to talk to you a little about what's in here and then what we can learn from it. The longest entry in the Record of Fugitive Slaves has to do with the well-known, celebrated Harriet Tubman, who, after her own escape from Maryland, made several forays in the 1850s back into Maryland, as you all know, and led some number around 70 fugitive slaves out of Maryland and to freedom in the North. She passed through Sidney Howard Gay's office twice in 1856. In the first, and in fact the longest entry in this thing is Gay's discussion with and almost interview with Harriet Tubman, in which she describes her career, her life, and these escapes. In May 1856, Gay recorded, quote, "Captain Harriet Tubman arrived with 4 fugitive slaves." It's interesting that he called her Captain Harriet Tubman, an unusual title to give to a woman at that time. It suggests that he knew her or knew of her before she turned up in his office. In this case, she described leading these 4 young men, all in their 20s, from the eastern shore of Maryland, the center of slavery in Maryland, up through Maryland, Delaware, and in Pennsylvania, and to New York. And she described it. This is what you find in this document. They started out on foot from Maryland on May 3rd, 1856. They got to Newcastle, Delaware, which was pretty close to where they started, and then they learned that the owners had, as she said, raised a hue and cry and posted a substantial reward for their capture, and they hid for a week in what she called a potato hole, which is kind of a root cellar or something like that, I assume, at the home of a free black woman in rural Delaware. Tubman traveled back and forth to Wilmington, Delaware by train at considerable risk, trying to find people who could help them. And finally, they did get to Wilmington and they arrived at William Still's office in Philadelphia on May 11th, and 2 days later, they are recorded as turning up in New York City. And Gay sent them up to Syracuse by train, he says, and eventually they headed to Canada. And in fact, 3 of the 4 men who came with Tubman are actually recorded in the Canadian census of 1861 as living near Toronto. So you can actually use these records to track out the whole story of these fugitive slaves. Later in 1856, Tubman turned up with another group passing through New York City. Now, it was typical that these slaves came from Maryland. More than half of the slaves recorded in this document originated in Maryland or Delaware. These were the eastern slave states closest to free soil. And obviously, it was a lot easier to escape from Maryland than it was from South Carolina or Alabama or someplace far away like that. But still, a considerable number came from further away. There's a considerable number listed from Virginia and North Carolina. Slaves of every age escaped, but most of them, I'm just talking about the 200 or so listed in this document, the average age was 25. They were youngish, and 3/4 of them were men. So they're young men. Because of that, they were at their prime, in the prime years of their working lives and of the greatest economic value to their owners, and their escapes were rather annoying or considerable losses to those who owned them. Now, Gay asked them what kind of work you did, and their answers show how slavery permeated every corner of the Southern economy. They ran the gamut from plantation laborers, which is not surprising, to workers on small farms, to household domestics, hotel porters, cooks, and skilled urban craftsmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, and even a man who operated a steam engine. Many of them had hired their own time. That is, they had lived apart from their owners in cities, passing along their earnings while being able to keep some money for themselves. And many of them were able to pay for assistance in escaping, as we'll see in a minute. Some of the owners, a few of the owners actually, only a few, were quite wealthy plantation owners. One was a guy named John Branch, who was a former governor both of North Carolina and Florida, and had plantations in both of those states and owned well over 100 slaves. But a much larger number were small farmers who only owned a handful of slaves, and as I said, for whom the escape of even one would be a significant financial loss. And many of them were many of the owners were non-agricultural people, merchants, everybody in the South owned slaves, it seems. Merchants, ministers, bankers, lawyers, a tailor, a tavern keeper, and even a U.S. naval officer. Now, Gay, as I said, interviewed them. Why did you try to run away? And the basic motive, as some of them said, was they wanted to be free, basically. That's the number one thing. They just were tired. One said, I was tired of being a slave. But most of them offered more immediate reasons for their decision to run away, and by far the most common was physical abuse. You will remember the movie last year, 12 Years a Slave, about Solomon Northrop, etc. And some people who saw that complained or commented that the violence in it was rather difficult to watch. It was kind of this very shocking violence. But while I'm not a fan of Hollywood history, as those who've been in my classes know, because I rant on about it frequently, the violence in that film was real. And these fugitives told stories to Gay replete with tales of frequent whippings and other brutality. The words they used, just a couple of, great violence, badly treated, hard master, very severe, a very cruel man. One called his owner the meanest man in Virginia. James Morris, who escaped from Norfolk, referred to his owner, a woman, Ann McCourt, as, quote, a heel of a woman. And he wrote a brief account for Gay, this is on a separate piece of paper up in the archives, of the treatment that he had been subjected to. This is what he wrote. 1 meal a day for 8 years, sold 3 times and threatened to be sold the 4th, struck 400 lashes by overseer, chopped across the head with a hatchet, and bled 3 days, tied hands and feet and knocked down with a stick, made to stand out in the cold 4 hours for punishment without shoes on. Second to physical abuse was the ever-present threat of sale. Many fugitive slaves, as they said, decided to run away either because members of their families had been sold just recently, or they were going to be sold, or they feared they were going to be sold. Sometimes it was because of the death of an owner, or sometimes they had overheard some discussion about their sale, and they decided they did not want to go down to the Deep South, as so many slaves were being sent from Maryland and Virginia, and took that occasion to run away. But these escapes always involved wrenching decisions about whether individual family members should go or stay. Many slaves, as I'll point out in a minute, escaped in groups. One of the things that surprised me in this document was that, our typical image of a fugitive slave is a lone person running away on foot, hiding in the woods in the day, running at night. There were plenty of people like that. But actually, more of these 200 in this list escaped in groups than individually. When they did leave in groups, these frequently included relatives, generally family groups, husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, even in some cases, small children, which of course made it much more difficult to get away. But nonetheless, no matter how large these groups, every single one of these people had left relatives in slavery. Mothers, fathers, wives, children, cousins, some relative or other. Many of them hoped that these family separations would not prove permanent. One guy, Charles Carter, told Gay that he was, quote, determined to get his wife and 4 children out of slavery. But usually there was very little Gay or William Still in Philadelphia could do to assist people to get relatives out. As I say, many slaves escaped not only in groups, but not just on foot. In fact, a considerable number came by sea. New York, of course, was a great seaport. The Atlantic coast was just filled at this time with ships of all sizes, shapes, and descriptions running up and down the packet lines, up and down the coast. There were these little networks, which you can trace out, beginning with this document, of people in different seaports who helped slaves get hidden on boats and sent north. One particularly active network was Norfolk, Virginia. The owners, one newspaper there complained, the owners of ships, quote, make the abduction of slaves a matter of trade and a source of profit. In other words, there were captains who just took money from slaves and hid them to take them up. They weren't abolitionists. They just were a little sidelight in their business. There was also what he called a secret society among the slaves that helped fugitives find hiding places until they could get them a boat. Black stevedores and crew members hid them on boats. One of the things, as you know, from Melville or other sources, is that sailor was a major occupation for African Americans in the first half of the 19th century. Many of the people who worked on the docks, both in the Virginia and in New York City, were African Americans who were willing to assist fugitives. So this is just one example here. In April 1855, a slave mother and child arrived in New York on a ship from Norfolk, having been hidden by the black cook. When the boat docked, the cook went ashore and hired a carriage to remove them. So he took the initiative in helping them out. William Still identified a slave, Henry Louis, known locally as Bluebeard, as the manager of the Underground Railroad in Norfolk. Louis's wife, Rebecca Louis, passed through New York City in 1856 and appeared in the Record of Fugitives. Bluebeard himself later escaped and joined her in Canada. The authorities in Norfolk found it impossible to figure out who was organizing these escapes. When a ship from Norfolk to Philadelphia was driven ashore in a storm in 1855, leading to the discovery of 5 fugitives on board, a local newspaper wrote that they hoped that when the captain came to trial, some clue may be obtained which will lead to the discovery of the president, directors, and agents of the Underground Railroad in Norfolk. So they just didn't know who they were. Now, of course, strict state and local laws prohibited aiding slaves to escape by sea or any other way. Ships were sometimes searched, and a number of captains and crew members were jailed. In 1856, what a newspaper called a New York Negro, who worked on a schooner, was arrested in Richmond, Virginia, after the discovery of 2 slaves hidden on board the ship. 2 years later, a Virginia court sentenced William Bayliss, a captain who carried fugitives for a fee on his schooner, sentenced him to 40 years in prison. And Bayliss remained incarcerated in Richmond until Union forces liberated the city in April 1865. But there were far too many ships to have all of them, or even most of them, inspected. One of the more intriguing figures, about whom we really know very little, who pops up in the Record of Fugitives and also in William Still's journal, is a captain called Albert Fountain, who owned a vessel, or ran a vessel called the City of Richmond, which sailed back and forth from Richmond and Norfolk, Virginia, to Philadelphia and New York in the 1850s. He often stopped at Wilmington, Delaware, to drop off slaves, fugitive slaves there. And there, a Quaker called Thomas Garrett sort of helped them and got them across the border to Philadelphia. Captain Fountain, wrote William Still, was not averse to receiving compensation for his services. Sometimes he charged up to $100 per slave. So these slaves had to gather money if they were going to get on Fountain's ship. He was a pretty courageous guy. Once, when his ship was about to sail from Norfolk with 21 runaways on board, officials arrived to inspect the ship. Fountain took out an axe and started, there's a picture of this in my book, I mean, it's an engraving, not an eyewitness one, but of the incident, and started shattering the planks on the deck to prove there was nobody down below. And the authorities, no, take it easy, Fountain, take it easy. Okay, we believe you. There were 21 fugitives down below, but by doing this, he convinced them there was nobody there, and they left. Fugitive slaves certainly appreciated Fountain's efforts. One, Thomas Page, who escaped from Norfolk on the City of Richmond in 1856 and came through New York, asked William Still 2 years later, quote, "Give my love to Captain Fountain," and urged him to visit Boston, as there are a number of his friends here who would like to see him. Now, these records of Sidney Howard Gay offer a glimpse into the numerous and ingenious ways that slaves employed to escape. As I said, there were groups that got on boats, many individually arranged with captains for their passage, many departed by train. Frederick Douglass, the most famous fugitive slave who passed through New York City, that was in 1838, borrowed the papers of a free sailor, got on a train in Baltimore, and arrived in New York City the next day. That was a lot easier than doing it on foot. Many of the fugitives that are mentioned in this document also took off by train. Harriet Eglin and her cousin Charlotte Giles, also of Baltimore, borrowed $5, quote, on the credit of Charlotte's mistress. I don't know quite what that means. They borrowed money from someone saying it was for the owner, but they took the money and bought train tickets to Philadelphia. Another common mode of escape involved appropriating or stealing their owner's horses and carriages. Mary Cummins, her adult son James, 11-year-old daughter Lucy, and another slave, all owned by a wealthy planter, Colonel Jacob Hollingsworth of Maryland, just rode off in his horse-drawn carriage one day. They got to Shippensburg, Maryland. They got on a train to Harrisburg, ended up in Philadelphia, in New York, and then further north. And again, some of them are in the Canadian census of 1860, living near Toronto. And of course, many slaves did escape by foot, sometimes over very large distances. One slave, Simon Hill, from Appomattox County, Virginia, told Gay, "I took to the woods and bent my steps northward, and in about 2 weeks reached Philadelphia." That was a distance of over 200 miles, which he covered in about 2 weeks. So this document is filled with interesting dramatic escapes by fugitive slaves, but it also contains insights into this network or series of networks that we call the Underground Railroad. We have to get out of our mind the idea that there were fixed routes, that there were fixed stations, that there were agents that people knew. Very few. No, and forget about quilts with secret passive. No, forget about that. There weren't any quilts. But there were these local networks which rose and fell over time. Some of them went out of it. The Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, as they called it, disappeared for about 5 years and then started up again in the 1850s. But they communicated with each other, and it was a kind of a very loose but real network of people committed to helping fugitive slaves. When slaves escaped in the South, some of them were assisted by like this little network in Norfolk or Thomas Garrett in Wilmington, but generally speaking, slaves who escaped from the South did so on their own, and when they were assisted, it was by local African Americans, either slaves or free blacks, often that they just encountered on their way, not that they had some pre-planned route. Once they crossed the Mason-Dixon line into southern Pennsylvania, they encountered many people, both black and white, willing to help them on their way. Chester County, Pennsylvania, in the southeastern part of Pennsylvania, was home to a sizable free black community whose churches gave shelter to fugitive slaves, and to numerous farm families, mostly Quakers, who forwarded them to William Still in Philadelphia and then on to New York. One black abolitionist there, Samuel Ringgold Ward, wrote that when slave catchers arrived in Chester County, Quakers threw all sorts of peaceful obstacles in their way, while the Negroes made it a little too hot for their comfort. Quakers didn't believe in violence, but they had other ways of trying to discourage slave catchers. And slaves who try to escape appear to have had the idea that there were people willing to help them. They didn't know there was a certain route, but they knew there were people in the North willing to help them, and they knew that Quakers were known to be anti-slavery. One fugitive, Henry Cooper, who escaped from Maryland, told Gay, "When I got to the town of North Chester, Pennsylvania, I stopped at a house and inquired for Quakers." No, he just knocked on the door, said, "Send me to a Quaker, and I'll be okay." Until the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which made the rendition of fugitives a federal responsibility and greatly strengthened the procedures for getting fugitive slaves and recapturing them. Until then, many runaway slaves just lived in southern Pennsylvania, working as farm laborers for these Quakers. But even many who had established comfortable homes there had to leave when the Fugitive Slave Law was passed in 1850. It was no longer possible to remain there because the Fugitive Slave Law was retroactive. You could have lived there for 20 years and you still were in danger of being seized and taken back to the South. Now in Philadelphia, as I said, you have what they called this Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, actually named after the New York Vigilance Committee, which was founded in the 1830s and was really the beginning of the Underground Railroad. The beginning of the Underground Railroad as a group of organizations trying to help fugitive slaves comes in New York with the creation in 1835 of this Vigilance Committee, which was first devoted to stopping the kidnapping of free black people and their sale into slavery. 12 Years a Slave talks about that. It was quite common in New York City at that time, and then quickly started helping fugitives reach further upstate New York. And as I say, William Still, this black abolitionist, was the key figure in Philadelphia, along with a few others. The Philadelphia Vigilance Committee was where one of the most famous fugitive slaves was literally unboxed. This was Henry Box Brown, a slave who hired someone, after his wife and children were sold to the Deep South, he hired a shoemaker actually to put him into a crate about 3 feet long and ship him, sort of like by UPS or whatever the equivalent was back then, to the anti-slavery office in Philadelphia. And for 24 hours he was in this crate. It was transported on a ship, on a train. He almost suffocated. It was a very dangerous thing to do. Nonetheless, this thing was delivered to the anti-slavery office, and William Still and some others took a hatchet, opened it up, and out popped Henry Box Brown. He wasn't called Henry Box Brown until later, but and he sang a hymn of praise when he got out. But he couldn't stay there. He was sent to New York, Boston, and eventually England, where he became a fixture on the anti-slavery circuit. Anyway, as I said, a majority of the people in this book had come through from Philadelphia, and generally William Still put them on a train, telegraphed ahead announcing their impending arrival, and gave them instructions on how to reach Sidney Howard Gay's office. Now, at that time, the train didn't come into Manhattan. It stopped across the way in South Amboy, New Jersey, and then you had to take a ferry across into Manhattan. And some of Gay's operatives would sometimes wait at the ferry for people coming off the ferry and the train. One abolitionist from Vermont wrote how in 1856 he was visiting Gay's office and a dispatch arrived from Still giving notice of, quote, 6 parcels are coming by train. And before I left the office, the parcels came in, each on 2 legs, he wrote. Usually the person who met the fugitives at the ferry or scoured the docks looking for those who had been hidden on ships was an interesting guy who we know very little about called Louis Napoleon. Louis Napoleon was an illiterate, free black man in New York City who was the chief operative, really, in Gay's office. He would be, as I say, meeting the fugitives, sending them off to upstate New York, scouring the docks, and also, even though he was illiterate, becoming involved in legal cases. It was Napoleon who got a writ of habeas corpus for a group of slaves this is a famous case, I'm not going to go into it here, the so-called Lemon case, a family called the Lemons from Virginia who were moving to Texas, came with a whole entourage, including their children and their slaves, through New York City, because you had to get to Texas from Virginia, you came to New York and got a boat to go all the way around. But by then, in the 1850s, it was illegal to bring slaves into New York. In other words, the law now said a slave brought voluntarily, not a fugitive, these were not fugitive slaves, brought voluntarily automatically becomes free. This was the famous principle of the Somerset case in England in 1772, that slavery only exists by virtue of local law, and when a person leaves that jurisdiction, they become free, and that was the case. So when these arrived, Napoleon found out and got a writ of, even though he was illiterate, he got a writ of habeas corpus. They were brought to court and they were freed. The judge said, I think it was 7 slaves, they were freed. Well, there's no slavery in New York, so you can't be slaves. Became a very important case. It was appealed, and it's called Lemon versus Napoleon. So he was a pretty important figure in these operations. We know little about him except that he was quite active and in Gay's record book, there's a whole page of payments, little payments to Napoleon, $1, $2 for the work he was doing assisting fugitive slaves. This little office in New York City stood, as I said, at the nexus, you might say, of 2 parts of the Underground Railroad. By the way, Gay's wife was herself a significant abolitionist and Quaker coming from Philadelphia. Her father had been a distinguished abolitionist, and so through his wife, he's connected with all these Quaker abolitionists in Pennsylvania, and then through his role as the editor of the Garrisonian newspaper, the Anti-Slavery Standard, he's connected with Garrisonian networks in New England and upstate New York. So he's sort of at the connection of these 2 parts of the Underground Railroad. And most of these fugitives were sent right away. New York was a very dangerous place to be a fugitive slave. There were slave catchers wandering the streets. As you all know, I'm sure, New York was considerably a pro-Southern city. It was linked very closely through the cotton trade to the slave South, and the local government was quite pro-Southern, and it was very dangerous to be a fugitive slave in New York City. In fact, after the fugitive slave law, several thousand African Americans just left the city. The 1850s is the only decade in our history where the black population of New York City actually declined because of people leaving because of the fugitive slave law. Well, they were quickly then sent to upstate New York and Canada. Gay directed more fugitives to Syracuse, halfway between Albany and the border with Canada, than to all other destinations combined. Syracuse was an abolitionist center. It was called the Canada of the United States because of the anti-slavery sentiment there. According to the manuscript U.S. Census, Ira Cobb, he lists at one point agents of the Underground Railroad that he deals with, about 10 or 12. And one of them is this guy, Ira Cobb, up in Syracuse. You go look him up in the census. He lived in the same building with the county sheriff. And nobody seemed to bother with the fact that he was helping fugitive slaves all the time. The sheriff just didn't want to bother with that. He certainly didn't fear arrest for his activities. The head of the Underground Railroad in Syracuse was himself a fugitive slave, Jermaine Logan, who had escaped many years before from Tennessee, I think. He was known as the Underground Railroad King of Syracuse. He had a business card, which he distributed, saying, I'm the head of the Underground Railroad here. In other words, in New York, it was pretty secret. Up there, it was totally open, totally known. He advertised in the local newspapers. Anyone sees a fugitive, send him to me. He held fundraising parties at his house, advertised in the press where fugitive slaves, 20 or 30, would be there. Nobody bothered him. One newspaper complained, the local Democratic newspaper, Logan drives his wagon loads of deluded fugitives around in open daylight. Nobody bothered him. But they were there on their way soon to Buffalo and then across the Niagara Falls Suspension Bridge, a wonderful bridge that was put up in 1855, I think, which enabled trains to go right across. And once you were in Canada, you were safe. The British government refused to extradite fugitive slaves, which became a major source of diplomatic contention with the United States in the whole period before the Civil War. The Brits, look, we all know, the British, they made millions and millions of dollars trading slaves in the 18th century, and then they had a fit of morality and abolished slavery in their empire, and then spent the rest of the 19th century patting themselves on the back for being so moral. But they did stand up to the United States, refusing to send back fugitives who escaped to Canada or to Bermuda, some appropriated ships. By the way, Mexico also refused to send back fugitive slaves from Texas, and that was a precipitating factor in the Mexican War of 1846. Once the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, you had to get to Canada in order to. Now, the fugitives, Gay's office worked pretty effectively, considering how few people. This is another thing. By my estimate, at any one time, there were no more than a dozen people in New York City, a city of 500,000, who were spending a lot of time helping fugitive slaves. There were plenty of people who helped them a little bit. There were these dock workers who would notify Napoleon if there was a slave on a ship. There were others who knew what to do. There were black ministers. If a fugitive slave came to a black church, they would know. But the people working very hard on this were a tiny number of people, but they were pretty effective. Although in one case they failed spectacularly. That was the case of Stephen Pembroke, a slave who escaped from Maryland with his two teenage sons, in 1854. He was the brother, Pembroke, of a prominent, also fugitive, who became a prominent abolitionist, James W.C. Pennington, in New York City, or Brooklyn, actually. Anyway, they got to Pennsylvania, got to Philadelphia, and were dispatched immediately by Still to New York. Now, professional slave hunters were notified by their owner and got on the same train with Pembroke and his two sons. They somehow realized this and got off the train in Newark unobserved, made their way to New York. They were put in what was considered a safe house, but in the middle of the night, the slave hunters found them, broke into the house, arrested them, and they were sent back to the South after a hearing at 9 a.m. the following morning before a U.S. commissioner, which didn't last more than 20 minutes. It all happened so fast that no attorney was present to represent them. Normally, the abolitionists would send an attorney to try to challenge. Usually, what they have to challenge is the identity. That this is not the person that you think it is. Anyway, Pembroke was actually then purchased by the abolitionists in New York. They raised money, but his sons were sold and basically never seen again, sold to the South. William Still thought that what he called a stool pigeon or traitor had revealed the hiding place, and he stopped sending fugitive slaves through New York City for a while. He said, I don't trust their security system there, for about a year. And then he started again dealing with Sidney Howard Gay more, because actually Pembroke had come through with another branch. I don't want to go into, it's complicated, but another branch of the Underground Railroad in New York had botched the Pembroke case. Still never sent anyone else to them, but now started again in 1855. That's when this begins, with Sidney Howard Gay's office. Gay meticulously recorded in this document also the money he spent. He you know, $1.50 for a train ticket to Albany, or money that came in. Generally, money came in from fairs organized by abolitionist women, where goods were sold, and the proceeds, some of them went to this to help Gay and his fugitive. But they always were running out of money. They always had to beg for money, and they never had enough to meet expenses. In fact, in 1856, cash received was, he risked $277. That included, but expenses, including the pay to Louis Napoleon, amounted to $457. So there was a deficit due to Sidney Howard Gay out of his own pocket of $180. As I say, one shouldn't think of the Underground Railroad as totally harmonious and successfully organized. In 1855, Gay wrote a letter to William Still, complaining basically about how he was sending slaves. He said, there's no other sure place but my office that I can advise you to send such persons. Those to me, therefore, must come in office hours. When possible, I wish you would advise me 2 days before of a shipment, as Napoleon is not always on hand to look out for them on short notice. The next year, he wrote to another abolitionist in Philadelphia, James Miller McKim, who worked with Still, saying, I hate to complain, but I must state a fact. Still is in the habit of sending men here by a train that arrives at 3 a.m. Unless it is absolutely imperative, it should not be done. To meet such persons, Napoleon has to be out by 1 o'clock, go 3 miles, take the men 3 miles back. Now, Napoleon, by this time, you can tell in the city directory, had moved way uptown to like 33rd Street, and it was a good way from the docks. Napoleon is a very old man. He was actually only 55, but that was pretty old. And he's paid a mere pittance for doing it. 3 days ago, Still telegraphed late. Napoleon had gone home, and we had no one in the office to do that duty for him. By the way, one of the nicest things about Louis Napoleon, in an appeal of the Lemon case, the judge, the lawyer for Virginia, asked sarcastically to John Jay II, the grandson of John Jay, the founding father, and John Jay II, a graduate of Columbia in the 1830s and a major abolitionist in New York. In fact, the only graduate of Columbia who became an abolitionist, as far as I can tell. But anyway, he asked Jay, is this Louis Napoleon who brought the case? Is this the Emperor of France? And Jay said, no, he's not. He's a much better man. So, anyway, this record of fugitives ends in 1856. Why? I don't know. It was dangerous to keep it. He was keeping a record of illegal activities. He stopped. But fugitives kept arriving in New York City. We know from other sources. The fugitive slave issue played a major role in the secession crisis. The longest paragraph in the South Carolina Declaration of the Causes of Secession had to do with the North's obstruction of the recapture of fugitive slaves. Even though very few fugitives got out of South Carolina too far, this was their number one complaint against the North as justifying secession. Well, anyway, just to conclude, the Underground Railroad ends in the Civil War. But once the Civil War begins, slaves do not have to run to the North. They can run to the Union Army. And as the Union Army penetrates the South, more and more slaves seek freedom, far more than had reached the North before the war, seek freedom, as you all know, with the Union Army. First dozens, then hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands, the so-called contrabands. And the Underground Railroad kind of disappears. William McKinn puts this notice in a newspaper in Philadelphia. He says, an end is put to the this is the end of 1861. An end is put to the Underground Railroad. I take this opportunity to thank the contributors to the Treasury of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee and to notify them that in all probability we will have no further call for their aid in this particular line of business. In New York, New York City, a writer in an abolitionist newspaper wrote, all the railroads in the North are doing a flourishing business because of the war, except one. The Underground Railroad now does scarcely any business at all. Scarcely a solitary traveler comes along. But incongruously, the fugitive slave law remained on the books until 1864. It was not repealed until although it was not enforced, it was not repealed until over a year after the Emancipation Proclamation. During Reconstruction, it had an ironic afterlife. Lyman Trumbull, the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, used the infamous law of 1850 as a template for the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which revolutionized American jurisprudence by extending to black Americans many of the civil rights formerly restricted only to whites. To do this, he drew on the fugitive slave law's enforcement mechanisms and criminal penalties and the way it imposed federal power on the states to enforce a constitutional right. In 1850, it was the constitutional right of owners to get back their slaves. In 1866, using the same system of enforcement, it was to protect the constitutional right of African Americans to freedom, which had been announced in the 13th Amendment, was now part of the Constitution in the 13th Amendment. The act that was passed that time, says Trumbull, for the purpose of punishing persons who should aid Negroes to freedom, is now applied to the punishment of those who should undertake to keep them in slavery. Or as another congressman said, we are turning the arsenal of slavery upon itself, wielding the weapon that slavery placed in our hands in the holy cause of liberty. So this is the kind of ironic aftermath of the fugitive slave issue, that the law of 1850 becomes the basis for one of the most important measures in American history, establishing equal civil rights for African Americans. I'll just end by one other document that struck me when I was doing this work, and this is the death certificate of Louis Napoleon, which is in the Municipal Archives. Anyone can find it. He died in Brooklyn in 1881, 4 days before his 81st birthday. And on his death certificate, enshrined for posterity, is listed his occupation, Underground Railroad agent. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Thank you. And thanks to the archives for making this document now available online, and it's well worth taking a quick look at. We have a little time for questions if anyone wants to raise it, or comments, and then you're all invited upstairs to partake of the hospitality of the Rare Books and Manuscripts Library. Yes, sir.
How long would it take for technology to make slavery completely obsolete?
It would never have happened. Technology is irrelevant to slavery. Slavery, current literature shows that slave owners used some very modern technology on their plantations, as well as modern business methods. And unfortunately, technology can be used by any kind of labor system. Slavery would have lasted, I think, this is not a, this is counterfactual history to say, if the Civil War had not taken place, or if the Confederacy had won its independence, there's no question whatsoever that slavery would have lasted into the 20th century. Would it still exist today? Probably not, but I have never yet seen a plausible scenario for its abolition peacefully, unfortunately. So, now there are economists who've studied this and said by the 1830s, in the Great Depression, the price of cotton fell so low that cotton agriculture would have been completely uneconomical. That's not quite technology, that's the world depression. But, is that true? I don't know. Maybe it's true. But I don't see Saudi Arabia giving up its oil production, even though the price of oil has fallen 50%. But, it would have lasted a long time, no question. Yes, ma'am.
Technology must have had the goal. Was there a central registry with the telegraph? Who was compiling information about who?
Well, there was no central clearinghouse of information, but it's certainly true that yes, technology both helped fugitives and helped those capturing them. Railroads made it much easier to escape by the 1850s. You could get from Baltimore to New York and then to Albany in Canada in a couple of days. Railroads also made it possible for slave hunters to capture them. The telegraph made it possible to communicate instantaneously. One ship that left Norfolk, it was discovered or heard that they were fugitives, and the mayor just wired ahead to the mayor of New York, and there were police waiting for that ship. So technology can be used in all sorts of ways. But the main technology, so to speak, were ads in newspapers. Owners would put ads in, for the recapture of fugitive slaves. The Baltimore Sun is full of these ads. I reproduce a couple in my book. Are any of those on our website? Yeah, so people who were in Gay's book, I found some of the fugitive slave ads for them, and I just reproduced them to show, because fugitive slave ads are very useful because they're very descriptive. They describe the person. If you're going to capture him, how are you going to know who he is? They give his height, his appearance, any scars, any marks, what kind of accent he speaks with, what he was wearing. So they're quite useful in, just getting a picture of these people, that kind of thing. Yes, John.
Well, once it's clear, there's financial figures here, and is it clear that the financial figures that Gabe kept might have been part of some larger budgetary system for?
Right, yeah, the first page, it's kind of hard to see, but let me see here. Ladies Society, Dundee, Scotland, sent by S. Rhodes, Philadelphia, $48.66. He got $48.66 from Scotland. And then the Ladies' Fair in New York, where they were selling goods for this purpose, $94.50, and then another $10. So he's keeping records. But no, my feeling is he's keeping these records for himself, that he's going to, so that he knows how much is coming in, how much. There was nobody else watching him and going over his books and saying, hey, look, yeah, you spent too much money on this. He's trying to keep a record of what he's spending and what's coming in, so he knows. Now, he did get money from the American Anti-Slavery Society up in Boston for the publication of his newspaper. That's where the money came from. And my feeling is he sometimes took some money out of that pot to reimburse himself or to do this. But really, nobody else, there was no treasurer, so to speak, anything like that. He was doing it all himself. His wife has a letter that I quote. In 1855, she wrote to someone, Sidney has the fugitive issue entirely in his own hands. That's quite a lot. He's also editing a newspaper every week, but it's mostly Louis Napoleon and another black man, William Leonard, working in his office who are doing Gay's not out on the docks looking for fugitives. He's got these two guys who are out there, what Wendell Phillips in a letter called Gay's runners. He has these runners who were out there looking, and then he organized. But this is 3 people. Then there were a couple of others, Jacob Gibbs, Louis Tappan, abolitionist, as I say, up to maybe a dozen, but it's not a giant operation, that's for sure. Yes?
A man named John Bigelow, in a source I've seen, was cited once as running something like a station of the Underground Railroad in Washington.
Yes, John Bigelow, not John Bigelow. Not the famous diplomat John Bigelow. Maybe it was John Bigelow. He was a businessman who had actually come from the North. Yeah.
Was this in Washington D.C.?
Yeah, Washington D.C.
Imagining fugitive slaves feeling safe in Washington.
Well, Washington had an anti-slavery movement, even though it was a city with legal slavery. Bigelow does pop up in here. He worked with some very secretly. Bigelow actually wrote letters to William Still, which Still reproduced in a book, in which he he had a pen name. It was like Thomas Paine or something like that. But And he had a whole code of things, you know, it's like these packages, you know, he'd send 2 packages coming. And he would also include, in one letter he said, I'm going to send you letters from now on. You can ignore all of the baloney. Like, I would never break the law. Everything I'm doing is totally legal. You know, and this kind of thing. He put these in letters in case they were intercepted by somebody. But Bigelow did operate. He was a businessman, and he seems to have operated a group in Washington who was helping fugitive slaves get out of Washington, and quite a few managed to. But it was very dangerous. Before Bigelow, there was William Chaplin there, who was captured and basically died in prison in Maryland. He was captured trying to help some fugitive slaves escape. So it was, if you're in a slave state doing this, you're really running a pretty big danger, you know? Yes?
I was wondering, how did apologists for slavery reconcile their support for a federal fugitive slave law with their supposed support for states' rights?
Wait, you have to stand up because I can't quite hear you. The acoustics aren't that great in here, so I'm sorry. Say it again.
No, I was just wondering, you were talking about like how South Carolina referenced the fugitive slave law and its enforcement. I was wondering how apologists for slavery, if at all, reconciled that federal act and its enforcement with the supposed.
Well, that's a great question. I have an article for last week on the lowest form of thing on Politico online. You know, don't believe what you, but anyway, this is true. But it's about states' rights and fugitive slaves. And this is a case where the South wants vigorous federal action, the most vigorous. The fugitive slave law is the most draconian exercise of federal power within states and localities in the entire period before, the entire history of the United States up to the Civil War. It overrides numerous local laws, local procedures. It makes it a federal crime, not only to assist a fugitive, but to refuse to assist a federal official. If a federal official comes up to me, hey, look, I'm chasing this fugitive, you got to come and help me, and I say, no, I don't think I want to do that, I'm committing a federal crime by just refusing to help him. What does this prove? It proves that the South did not believe in states' rights. That is a misnomer. The South believed in slavery. When federal power was necessary to protect slavery, that was cool. Most of the time, states' rights were a protection of slavery because slavery is a creature of state law. It's created by state law, so the greater the rights of the states, the less outside interference there's going to be. But when it came to overriding laws in the North, they were perfectly happy to do that. So states' rights is not a consistent Southern position, and the fugitive slave issue certainly shows that. We have to, so we'll have one more question, okay?
One more question.
Okay, go ahead, right here.
How significant was the British and Mexican refusal to turn over fugitive slaves to causing the Oregon crisis in the Mexican-American War? Was the South willing to fight a war?
Well, the Oregon crisis is a little different because there weren't a heck of a lot of slaves up there in Oregon running away. The Mexican War was caused by many things. I think this was an irritant. I don't think it was the main cause of the Mexican War, but certainly with the British, you start with the American Revolution, where thousands of slaves ran away to the British, and many of them left with them and obtained their freedom, including, you know, New York was occupied by the British during the war, and about 3,000 slaves were left with the British, to the great annoyance of the Americans. In fact, George Washington had he met with the British commander, Carleton, and he said, you know, I would appreciate if you'd look out for a couple of my fugitive slaves who ran away, and I think they're in New York. And Carleton said, well, we're taking them all with us because we've promised them their freedom, and it would be ungentlemanly to turn them over. And Washington was quite annoyed. And then later with, as I say, Canada, Bermuda, the refusal, it was a constant irritant in Anglo-American relations in the 19th century. So you have to give the British credit, despite their being so kooky, that they did refuse to send fugitive slaves back to the United States. All right. Anyway, thank you all, and do take a look at this.